Our government was based upon the idea that there are certain rules and laws that have been put in place that have existed even before we did. The reason we make these claims is to teach one another that there are some rules that cannot be broken. Some people will tell you that these rules come directly from God. And the reason they do this is to illustrate that these rules cannot be touched by anyone who lives on earth. That protects them. It takes these rules away from human beings who would then manipulate those rules in order to oppress you. You can also say that these rules come from nature, which is another way of saying that they are observable rules. They are things that are like gravity and other scientific principles that can be observed. So in our country and in our documentation, we claim that there are some rules that cannot be changed, either because they come from deity or because they have been observed to be far more effective than any other rule. When you observe things like a communist society, the reason many people do not like those things is because it has been observed that there are many great flaws in that type of government. It has a less than effective result on the individual, which is the most important component of any society, the individual. A free society is much more effective. It is much more efficient because the end result is that the individual has more freedom and is able to be happier in their everyday life. They find life more fulfilling, and they are free to do other things that are very good to do. Whereas in a more oppressive society, even when you see something that is good that you could do as an individual, even with very little effort, you are not allowed to do that because your movements and your words are carefully controlled. The idea is to point out that there are self-evident truths, things that you can observe. Do it this way and see the results. Do it this way and see those results, and compare the two. When you allow the individual the maximum amount of freedom, you get the maximum amount of happiness and you get the maximum amount of productivity, which does ultimately help the group. When you carefully control everything that the individual does and says, you get the least amount of productivity. You get the least amount of happiness. You get the least amount of fulfillment. If man were the source of these great rules, then man would have the authority to change them. But we do not want that. You do not want humankind to have the authority to change some of the rules you live by. That is the other point to these rules, the rules of nature and of nature's God. The idea is to illustrate that there are some things you cannot change and you must do them this way, and that no human entity is allowed or has the authority to supersede those rules. Those rules were in place long before we even existed and must remain in place, or else we will suffer the consequences as a society for breaking these rules. Now, when an individual does something wrong, the individual will receive those natural consequences. But when a government, when a nation does things wrong, then the entire nation receives those consequences. So as a nation, it is best to build its rules around the rules of nature and of nature's God. That way, when you do things right, you can reap all of the benefits. And hopefully, you will minimize doing things wrong and therefore minimize all of the consequences that all of your people will have to pay. This is what the Declaration of Independence refers to when it mentions the laws of nature and of nature's God. If human beings had the authority to change some of the rules that you live by, that would be a devastating thing. You do not want that. You do not want people to have control over some of your basic human rights. You want that to be a carefully protected rule that no one is allowed to touch. Otherwise, there would be no such thing as right and wrong, even if it means killing you to take something you own. Because what would define that to be wrong? If human beings are allowed to make that definition, then they can change it anytime they want. You do not want that. Goodbye, bunnies.